name is Kayla Creek. I'm the local district conservationist with the NRCS. And Miss Donita is hiding in the kitchen, but she's the district clerk with the local Blackwater Valley Soil and Water Conservation District who is hosting this meeting. We have Todd Montandon, who is our local Texas Parks and Wildlife biologist. He covers Bailey County. And then his cohort, Jeff Bonner, out of Pampa. He's the technical biologist. But if you guys have any questions, I'm sure that you feel, they got some presentations. You guys ask questions. This is to help get you guys the best information possible and to help you all. So take advantage of it.
Thanks, Kayla.
It's on.
I just wanted to thank the Soil and Water Conservation District for having Parks and Wildlife here. As y'all know, the lesser prairie chicken is a candidate species, and we'll explain exactly what all that is here in a little bit for the endangered species, for being an endangered species. And we're here kind of to give y'all as much information as we can about the proposed listing and what it's going to mean to y'all, how it's going to affect landowners if the chicken does end up getting listed as threatened or endangered. And we'll present y'all with some options, one being the candidate conservation agreement with assurances. And that's an agreement that's been set up between the Fish and Wildlife Service and Texas Parks and Wildlife that we can bring to you as landowners to help y'all with the imminent listing. And with that, I'll give it over to Jeff. Jeff Bonner, he's our technical guidance biologist out of Pampa, and his country is the whole panhandle down to Snyder and across the bottom to New Mexico. My country, I'm stationed out of Canyon, and my country is basically Amarillo south to just north of Lubbock, all the counties, and then along the Cap Rock over to New Mexico. So Jeff.
Let me see if I can. Let me see if I'm loud. Am I loud enough for everybody? I have a hard time, but my wife says if she could tie my hands behind my back, I wouldn't be able to speak. So I tend to be a little active. So how has everybody here been out and seen prairie chickens on a booming ground doing their thing? Who has seen such? Very nice. All right, so there's a big
Saw
bus.
one in 1955 north of Uchi, but I haven't since then.
Okay, well that counts. Well, what I'm going to share with you first, right quick, is a DVD. There's a bunch of them at the table over there, and I think I've already seen some of you got it. So we're just going to take a quick look at that, so that those of you who haven't seen them on the booming ground before will have an opportunity to see and hear the birds. And then after that, then we'll get on and start addressing some other stuff.
It happens each spring, as it has for thousands of years. As the orange glow in the eastern sky signals a new dawn, they begin to gather. First one, then two, then more arrive at this place far out on the prairie. And then the show begins. The lesser prairie chicken, the little grouse of the prairie, has taken center stage for another performance. With its unique sights and sounds, the mating ritual of the lesser prairie chicken is one of nature's most spectacular plays. By late winter, the attentions of male prairie chickens begin to narrow from their extensive prairie habitats to focus on communal mating grounds known as leks. Also called gobbling grounds, these leks are often located on traditional sites used year after year. The number of males that come to perform can vary from a few to several dozen. Through a series of ritualized displays, calls, and occasional fights, males establish a hierarchy. The most dominant, usually older males, typically occupy the center of the lek. Younger males establish positions at the periphery, but are constantly seeking opportunities to elevate their status and move closer to center stage. And with good reason. Unlike more familiar species of birds, lesser prairie chickens don't form lasting pair bonds between males and females. The lek functions as a gallery of males from which visiting hens can compare and select. When hens are present on the lek, the level of display and calling intensifies as the males pull out all the stops to impress them. Matings are brief, and the hens later assume all the duties of nesting and chick rearing.
All right, I just want to make sure everybody got a chance to see and hear what the bird sounds like. It's a very distinctive call that they make, that boop, 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 boop. You can hear that for miles. So as long as it's a nice calm day and you're on top of a hill and they're on top of a hill, you can hear them a long ways off. That DVD, by the way, is about 50 minutes long. I'm not exactly sure how long it is, but it's full of good info. Has lots about the bird's history, has a whole lot about habitat, stuff like that, so y'all want to go and watch the rest of that at your leisure. I would like to say, before we get going too much further, I want to make some distinctions about the roles that the different agencies will play. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which is your federal agency, is the agency that will be taking on the sole responsibility of the listing process, as they call it. So the bird gets put on the endangered or threatened species list. That is the duty and actions of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. The state of Texas, the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department that I'm employed with and Todd is employed with, has nothing to do with the listing process. Not entirely true, because what we're doing right now is to try and prevent it. We would like to see the bird not put on the threatened or endangered species list. And part of what we're doing here today is to try and tell y'all about an opportunity that y'all can take on that will also add to that effort of not listing the bird. So I'll say that so that we won't get diverged off on folks that showed up to vent their frustration about the federal government. It's my place. Don't tell me what to do. I agree with you 110%. So that's not the place. Here is not the place for that. There's no U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service people here or anything that can do anything about it. And so the one thing that we can do is right here, the CCA thing that we're going to talk about, okay? So, see if I can scoot out everybody's way a little more. Swing it. Okay, let's see. So what we're going to do, we're going to talk a little bit about the bird's history and some biology about him. If I set that right there, I promise I'll try hard not to knock it over on you. I'll try not to knock it over on you. So we'll talk a little history about the bird, and then a little bit about the biology, a little about what it does, where it likes to live, what it needs to live. Then we'll talk about the listing. Why is all this a big deal? Why is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service talking about putting them on the threatened or endangered species list and what that will mean? And then we'll talk about the CCAA. And I'll tell you more about what that means, but basically that stands for a Candidate Conservation Agreement with Assurances. And that is our one bullet in our gun that we have in having a little bit of say in what direction the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service goes on this listing. Now the lights on, everybody see that good? Yeah. So one of the ranchers that I work with up in the northeastern, which by the way, I've worked for 10 years up in the northeastern Texas Panhandle. I was responsible for the 9 counties over there in the country, East Amarillo, north of Childress. In the last 2 years, I took a job as a technical guidance biologist where I lost a lot of the regulatory stuff where we fly around and count mule deer and do spotlight counts for whitetails and count antelope and quail and pheasant and everything else. And so now I focus strictly on private land assistance all across the whole Panhandle district. So a guy I worked with up in Hemphill County, he gave me this picture, and he claims, he's an honest guy, he claims this is his granddaddy. And he doesn't really know when the picture was taken. He would guess sometime before the Depression. But this was right outside of Bushland, Texas. Y'all know where Bushland is? It's about 15 miles due west of Amarillo down I-40. That's where Bushland is. And so it was back a pretty good while. Clearly it was back before there were bag limits. Right? And also before gun safety rules. And I put that up there for, a couple of reasons. One, I hear a whole lot, everywhere I go, I hear the stories of back in the 50s, I guess after the drought, so you'd be talking late 50s, in the 60s and 70s, of folks that used to grow milo. They used to shock milo out the field, and the gazillions of prairie chickens that would fly in there to take advantage of some of that grain. So, sure enough, at one point in time, there have been boo-coos of prairie chickens in this country. And when I say in this country, we're talking about the Panhandle as a whole. We'll get a little bit further down the road and we'll talk about what we got remaining. Let's see, this was a monthly bulletin put out in August of 1942 by the Texas Game, Fish, and Oyster Commission, which actually is today the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. They changed their name a couple of times, I guess. But the thing that I thought was interesting, here in August of 1942, there's a section right here about 24 brooding areas in Panhandle area fixed for grouse. They were still calling them grouse, and they're a member of the grouse species. And I like this part right here, especially being in the Panhandle and farming country. I grew up in Canyon, by the way, spent many summers sitting on a tractor. The portion that says, the grouse is now protected by law in Texas and may not be molested at any time. Aside from its excellent qualities as a game bird, who was it that got here earlier was talking about eating prairie chickens that don't taste good? Who was that? Don't be afraid. Come on. Not going to admit it? Okay, there you go. All right, there we go. Yeah, they're not very good, actually. So whoever wrote this obviously never sank his teeth into one. Aside from its excellent qualities as a game bird, it also is a consistent feeder on insects, such as grasshoppers, and is thus worth thousands of dollars annually to Panhandle farmers. That's the old days of old-fashioned biological control, right? Anyway, I forget what the point is. I get telling stories and forget what the point is. So the point is, when those of you that are worried about, well, we've heard that the prairie chicken may be listed. And so the last thing I want to do is let anybody find out that I got chickens on my place. 1942, and they go way back. And everybody knows where the chickens are. And everybody knows what chicken habitat looks like. And right now, the direction that they're going with the listing, it really won't matter whether you got one there or not, if it looks like it's going to make good-looking chicken country. In the 40s, they started to get a little concerned about the chickens. This is a map of what we call a study area up in Hemphill County. And this is north of Canadian. And this represents about 65,000 acres of these properties. And today, we count this exact same property. And it's very unique to have a data set on a wildlife species that goes that far back and is conducted the exact same way. And basically what those guys would do, they'd get out there, drive around, listen for birds, draw themselves a hand map. They didn't have the fancy stuff I got today. And then they'd go back every spring and see where if those birds were still using those sites and how many there were. And that's how you do a count. You get the month of April when you're on the booming ground, because they are very easy to find. The rest of the time of the year, they're not too easy to find. And all these little dots you see, the circles and the triangles and all that, are the booming grounds. Interesting thing about booming grounds, they have been using the same hilltops and the same booming grounds for who knows how long. Because some of these same booming grounds you can go to in April of 2012, and there's birds on that hill right there in the exact same spot. And so they're tied to these booming grounds. You may hear me say the word lek, or you may hear a lek on that DVD, and that's just a $5 word for a booming ground. Let's see. Oh, so again, to reiterate, everybody's known where the chickens are, at least since 1942. So don't feel like sneaking off and hiding them is keeping anything, and I'll get more on that here in a minute. So, a little bit about the bird. This is a male, and when he's feeling amorous, he's got his nice big yellow comb going. And these long feathers that you saw in the video and the DVD, they stick up over their ears when they're showing off for the girls, strutting. Those are called pinnae feathers. And what you can't see there is underneath there is that orange air sac that he puffs up and then forces air out to make that neat little flopping sound that they make. So they get out there and they puff their feathers all up, strut around, stomp their feet. You gotta be really close to hear that. You can hear a little bit on the DVD. It's like a... And that must be strictly close communication, I guess. I guess the pump pump is to draw the girls in when they get close. You show them what a great man you are by how fast you can stomp your feet, I guess. I don't know. Here's a hen. No eye comb. They still have the pinnae feather, but it's nowhere near as pronounced. And so usually the easiest way, unless you're like in sometime in October maybe when they're molting, sometimes those feathers will molt off and the male won't look like that. But usually if you get a good look at one, they're pretty easy to distinguish because that male has that long dark feather that comes all the way down its shoulder. And here's one of the little yellow popcorn fuzz balls. And a hard time that we're having is getting these guys from this size to this size. And they're doing a little study there. They're putting a little bitty tag on that bird, trying to figure out where she goes. Let's see, I'll get more to that in a second. All right, so the lek, or the booming ground, is what the prairie chickens are most known for, because that's where they're very visible. They get up, they dance, they show lots of color, they do lots of singing, and that's where breeding takes place. And one of those dots, in fact, where I took this picture right here, I'm going to go backwards. Oh, that's forwards. It's backwards if you're looking over your shoulder. I took that picture right there, which in 1942 had 7 males on it. So it's kind of interesting that they're using this same country year after year, and it kind of shows you how important some of that is. So, naturally, when the feds start talking about listing a bird, everybody starts paying attention, and we start saying, well, gee, what do we know about it? Well, we don't know. So, get a bunch of funding together, everybody's ready to start throwing money at them. And so we've done lots of research on them. Texas Tech, A&M have done some research. And some of the interesting things that they have found out doing DNA work, actually catching these guys and doing DNA on them. And the reason that they're doing that, the purpose behind it, was to see if some of these populations have got isolated from one another. And so kind of like an Arkansas kind of situation where they're not getting out diversifying like they should. And so what that'll show, there's nobody from Arkansas, is there?
I got relatives go back, way back.
It's okay. My mama was born in Smackover, Arkansas, so I can't talk about it. Anyway, interesting thing that they're finding out with the DNA is that all the males, most of the males on a booming ground tend to be related to one another. Uncles, nephews, cousins, that kind of thing. And the hens tend to be much different, genetically speaking. Now, the interesting thing about that is usually in the wild world, males tend to take on the responsibility of dispersal to ensure genetic diversity. What that means is that the hens are the ones, unless they're prairie chickens, that are taking on that responsibility. Now, the hard thing we're finding, or the hard thing to find out is how far does she go and where does she go? And you saw them guys putting that little tag on that little chick. What they're hoping is they catch her somewhere, they'll know where she came from. But so far, we're not being very successful with that. Yep, I already talked about that. Get a little ahead of myself. All right, so the way that'll work, you got all those booming grounds. You saw that map with all the dots on it. Well, generally speaking, on average, most of the nests will be within 2 miles of that booming ground. Now, they have been well documented nesting up to 5 miles from the booming ground. And so I say that so you'll have a concept of the scale that these birds are living on. They're not like a covey of quail. You look at a house covey that comes up every morning, or when you take the dog out, you know you're going to get one down there at that corner by that plum thicket, where you always see them in the same spots. These chickens are using a huge amount of space. They're very mobile, can be. So if you consider, if a hen's going to use a space 5 miles from a booming ground to nest, and if you consider the radius of that and calculate what that area is, it comes up to 5,240 acres. And so that's the scale that these birds are living on. And here is an interesting little tidbit as well. A hen, if she gets her nest predated early on and attempts to re-nest, unlike a quail or a turkey that's going to try, instead of this bush, I'll try that bush, or instead of this side of the hill, I'll try that side of the hill, these hens get up and leave the country. The furthest movement that they've documented that I'm aware of right now is 18 miles. And we've still got transmitted birds out there. That's a long ways. And I don't know, for those of you who have been around chickens and seen them a lot and flushed them, you know how far they'll fly. I've watched them in binoculars until they're just teeny little specks and you can't even see them anymore. The booming ground, most of the activities are early in the morning. They will gather up in the evenings for a little bit, but most of that's activities in the morning. They go carry on and sing and dance as long as the weather's good for a couple hours. And the males, that's a good demonstration there. They all get their own, they defend their own little area. So like say, the size of this room would be a pretty good sized booming ground. It would probably hold about 10 birds or so. Well, out there in the pasture and the grass, they have drawn these little imaginary lines between each other. Can't see them, but they can see them. And so they all fight and defend whatever their little space is. And the guy in the middle, at the top of the hill, is the guy that gets most of the girls. The research they've done shows he's getting close to 80. He's doing close to 80% of the breeding. Hen shot, breed, go nest. And just an interesting little tidbit, doesn't have anything to do with what we're talking about, but it's just really neat. So there's a hawk specialist at Texas Tech University, crazy about hawks. And so he wanted to see how successful hawks are. I mean, everybody knows hawks eat prairie chickens and quails and stuff like that, right? He wanted to see how successful they were at getting prairie chickens off the booming ground. Because they're out there in the wide open, very exposed and very vulnerable. So he stuck video cameras on these booming grounds, and they got some poor sap of a graduate student to sit down in front of a TV for hours and hours and days on end watching prairie chickens dance. And what he did, he documented what hawks came in and how successful were they, how many attempts did they make. Well, for one thing, they found out it don't happen very often, and two, they are not successful at all. But the interesting thing that came out of it was you have different kind of hawks that attack a target in different ways. Falcons, like your peregrine falcon, your prairie falcon, they like to snatch stuff out of the air. They're aerial predators, whereas red-tailed hawks and harriers, which I'm going to call marsh hawk, they like to attack stuff when it's on the ground. Interesting thing about the prairie chickens, what they got to noticing, if a falcon approached the booming ground, all the chickens would squat. If a red tail or a harrier approached the lake, they'd all flush. So we're talking about a little old bird we don't give much credit to, with the ability to do something kind of neat. I've tried to teach my kids how to ID birds. They ain't got it yet. The chickens, they just got it. All right, everybody always wants to know, what do they eat? Yes, they will eat Milo. And it's very likely that we carried abundant populations that were probably well above what could be carried naturally back in the old shock and Milo days. But also, certainly, there wasn't anybody growing Milo for them for the thousands of years before we white men showed up. Weeds are a very important part, the important part of prairie chicken diets. In the springtime, they offer leafy greens. Those leafy greens, very high in vitamins, nutrients they need for egg production. And when the chicks hatch, they have to have a high protein diet. And there's no other higher protein diet out there for a bird than bugs. Caterpillars, butterflies, grasshoppers, which where do you usually see the most of those? In weedy areas. Mass crops are important. There's scenery in this country. How often, how many years out of 10 will you make a big acre crop? Anybody? 2? Maybe? 1? Not something to be relied on. Seeds from weeds is what gets them through the fall and winter. So the weeds that were offering them leafy green material in the spring that also increased insect production for the chicks to eat, now are providing seed to get them through the fall and through the winter. All right, habitat needs. I've broke this down to a couple of basic pieces of habitat need. Number one, the prairie chicken need that kind of sets him apart from everybody else, and it's the one thing that kind of has his hiney in a crack right now, is that he likes wide open spaces. Does not like obstructions. And that means obstructions of things like shelter belts, houses, barns, trees, power lines, pump jacks, tank batteries, transmission lines, power lines, anything like that, he has an issue with. Some of the research that they've done, up in Kansas, they have those little radio transmitters on, they can follow them around everywhere they go, and what they found is that on average, they tend to shy away about a quarter mile from objects, from man-made objects. Now, will they get up closer than that? Yes. Will they cross that? Yes. But they're talking mainly about the space that they're using. One of the things they looked at was the nesting hens definitely tend to stay a quarter mile away from that. So if you just kind of mentally think, okay, let's see, out in our part of the country, we've got, there's a house and barn over there, and there's a bunch of oil gas work over there. If you drop a quarter mile circle around every one of those, you start taking that big usable space, where that 50,000 acres I was talking about that they're living in, and that gets whittled down and whittled down. One of the reasons why we're doing the DNA work is see if that's been whittled down so much that some of those populations aren't working back and forth with each other. That's why the numbers are going down. They don't have the genetic diversity that they need. So that's some of the research that's been done. This was a picture taken by a guy in Kansas right before they went in with a wind farm. And this was the first road that they built in as a collection line. And so when it comes to usable space, after they finished the project up there, that's not what was usable space. None of that is now usable space. And that's a drastic example of what I'm talking about, but it kind of demonstrates how that open space goes from use to non-use. Oh, and I'm so sorry, y'all. If anybody's got a question, please do not be afraid. Raise your hand or holler out something, okay? I'm a fairly relaxed kind of guy. I would rather address stuff than you sit and wonder about it, or just be left to your own imagination. So please don't be afraid to holler with a question, okay? All right, so they need big, wide open spaces. Number two, they need nesting cover. So those birds that they put those transmitters on and followed around, well, they followed a couple hundreds of hens around over several years, and they know She nested right there. So they wait till she finishes her business. They got it marked. As soon as she's done, they go in there and they take one of these, measure how high is the grass, stretch a tape this way, what plant species do we see right here, how far can she see, what kind of cover does she have, how tall is it, and all that. So you do a couple hundred nests like that, you start getting a pretty good idea of what kind of places they like to build their nest in. And their favorite nesting habitat is tall bunch grasses. Little blue stem, oh, everybody all knows what little blue stem is. Sand blue stem, which is big blue stem, it's $5 word for big blue stem. Indian grass, switchgrass, things like that. So got to have nesting cover, and in the cattle world, that means that the cows got to leave. If there's a place for them to build a nest, it's got to be left. Because the point is that the grass that she's going to build a nest in April is grass that was grown the previous year. And it's remained standing all through the year, all through the winter, and is now there available for her to build a nest in. Brood rearing habitat. All right, so she's got good nesting cover. She's had her clutch. They hatched. They're up running around. Now we need something quick and handy for them chicks to have to move through where they get some good groceries. Weedy areas are the best for bucking. Plus, they tend to have a more open area underneath where they can move around and be mobile, but still have a little head cover. And this is where grazing, again, becomes very important. A 100% dominated grassland with few weeds, but not enough hoof action, and the cattle not removing that grass, keeping it fresh, creating open spaces, can minimize weed growth. Little chicks need a little head cover too. This little plum thicket, this country, you're probably talking mostly shinnery and sagebrush in the right amounts. And finally, the booming ground again. Booming grounds, they tend to be areas of real short grass where they can be seen real easily. And some of this country, they use old abandoned oil pads.
Hey, Jeff, one of the things when you were talking about when you were talking about hens nesting, they'll use a 5-mile radius from the let. You said that, I think you said it was 5,000 acres. It should be 50,000.
Oh, did I say 5? Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I'm sorry. I didn't even say 5,000. Yeah. Yeah, 5-mile radius. Yeah, I said, oh, that goes back to what? Junior high, pi large squared. Yeah, 50,240 acres. Thanks, Prairie. Yeah, that's a big difference. All right, so here is, as of last year, and I stressed last year, and the reason I stressed last year is because this map is constantly changing. And one of the reasons that it's constantly changing is because we keep finding new birds, which is good news. One of the things that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is going to look at when it comes to listing, one of their criteria is what percentage of their historic range do they still occupy. Okay, so their historic range was pretty much all of this up in Nebraska. So the bigger the green gets, the more reason there is to not list the bird. And don't get too caught up. We had some guys at some of the other meetings were getting really caught up about, now where does this line right here? Here's my place is right. If I'm in the white, I'm not going to be bothered by this, right? Not necessarily. After some of those questions, I've gone and looked that up in the CCAA document. And it states that it can be applied, the CCAA anyway, can be applied to anything that's currently occupied habitat or potential habitat that may or may not be occupied. So if it looks like chicken country, we should include it. But this is where we currently know we got birds. Basically, the way this was built, let's say we saw a bird right here. And say that was in some rolling sandhill sagebrush country with little blue stem and big blue stem. Well, we got a bird in that habitat right here. I seen it. And so now I have that same kind of habitat. If I go walking, say, south, as long as I'm in that habitat, it stands to reason for a bird that's using 50,000 acres that's usable space to a prairie chicken until I hit something that's different. So if I have a soil type change and I get more of a clay soil instead of a sandy soil, and instead of those tall grasses and sagebrush, now I'm looking more at maybe some mid grasses like silver blue stem, cytotrigoma, with maybe some scattered catclaw or yucca and things like that. So I stop when I hit that change. Unless I find a bird out in that new habitat type. If I find a bird out in that new habitat type, now it stands to reason, as long as I'm in that habitat type, that's usable prairie chicken space until I hit yet another habitat type. So, thus we have drawn along the little lines. A lot of this in here is a moving target with a mix of CRP and farm ground and things like that. And as well as we're still getting out to new areas and finding. And to tell you where that puts us as Parks and Wildlife Department, those duties of doing our prairie chicken surveys in the spring, you know, I showed you that 65,000 acres where we send out a biologist. He's got to go out there and find all those blooming grounds. He's only got 2 hours in the morning to do it. And he can only do it on days where the wind ain't blowing too hard in April. And so now once he gets that job done, which is a priority, now he's got time to go out there and start cruising around and listening and seeing where else he can find birds. And so we're strictly limited on time. So we started all this, 5, 6 years ago is when it all started boiling to a head. And this is about as fast as we're getting around. Now we have done some research on some aerial surveys that are proven to be very productive. However, that technique's kind of been taken and twisted a little bit now that the multiple states have got their hands in the pot. But bottom line is, don't get married to this because it could change tomorrow. I just wanted to get a feel for where we're at now. All right, so what's the big deal? Why are they going to put the bird on the list? Well, there's a couple of big reasons. Number one, the populations have not been doing very well. This is our data from the northeastern panhandle. This includes that 65,000 acres that you saw, plus several additional ranches in Wheeler County and Gray County, for a total of around 87,000 acres. On that 87,000 acres, y'all remember I'm talking about just those little studies. I'm not talking about the whole panhandle, okay? Just that 87,000 acres in 2000 hit a peak of about 690 some odd chickens on those booming grounds. That was pretty good. And this is when they first started talking about getting serious about listing. And I was like, man, what's the big deal? That's close to what they were in 1952. Well, since that time, this is what they've done. And so this year, 2012, just this past April, had a record low, and it went from 690 some odd chickens all the way down to 62. 10%, slightly under, left that were there 12 years ago. Some of that in places down in this country. Todd, can you touch really quick on what the numbers down here done, long range speaking?
Yeah, since about, we've been counting, I don't know how long we've been counting, but since I've been here, since 2007, what I'll do is go out and drive county roads and just stop and listen. And since we've been doing that, the first year I counted around 50 birds or so in Bailey County. And then this year, since Jude has gotten down to the refuge, he will go out and some of his guys will go out too, so we're covering more ground. And this year we counted over 100 birds in Bailey and Lamb County. So this area seems to be doing pretty good as far as holding birds and making new birds.
Is that because the population has gone up, or you just doing a better job of finding them?
Could be both.
Could be both. Yes, sir.
The water situation.
Water?
Yeah. What about water?
Well, you know, they're doing a lot of research on that right now. And what we are finding is if you'll provide them with open water, they will absolutely use them. They're doing, Texas Tech right now has got tons of these cameras. They've got some wells out there with some little overflows to the ground. You got some on tanks. They'll drink out of the tanks. As soon as you make an overflow to the ground, they quit using the tank, they go to the ground.
Well, when they're nesting, does their eggs have to have the humidity to hatch them?
I don't think, we haven't quite got around on the prairie chicken like we have on the quail work. Certainly it's all go in that direction, but I don't know any particulars about that right now. They are talking about, what they're studying right now is use of the water and looking to see if they get higher chick survival, successful nesting in areas that were offered water. And so, yeah, I do think that's important. It kind of falls back on the old Milo days thing as well. And there wasn't just wide open water out here on the prairie for thousands of years. We do know that ground nesting birds, quail, turkey, prairie chickens, get their water mainly from the food they eat, called metabolic water. They get it from the seeds, the concentrate, they get it from bugs and things like that. And pheasant, same way. Doesn't mean if you have water they won't use it. But it does mean that there's plenty of evidence that would say you can maintain a population if they have everything else they need. They shouldn't need a steady supply of well-distributed open water. Does that make sense? But they're looking into it and say, hey, if we grow some more chickens, by all means, let's give them some water. Right? Especially right now, right? What has kept us from getting listed, I think, this is my opinion, so far, is the state of Kansas. Back in the 80s, when CRP came out, Kansas made a rule, we are planting only native mixes. Anything that gets enrolled in CRP is going to be planted in a native mix. And they threw a little alfalfa there to keep a little natural fertilization going and offer a little shrubby, woody cover. Kansas guys are driving through some farm country doing their pheasant surveys they've been doing every year, and lo and behold, they heard chickens. They were like, hey, there's chickens out here. So over the last 10, 15 years, whereas everybody else's populations have been decreasing and struggling, popping and going, Kansas, prairie chicken populations have been growing and expanding into areas of native mixed CRP. That's encouraging. Because the encouraging part of it is it shows that if they can get what they want, how they want it, the right distribution, the right open, and whatever else it is, they will grow and expand and do well. So that part's very encouraging. Kansas has had decreases in their population in the sandhill sagebrush country, but their CRP mixes have done very well. All right, so issue number one was populations are going down. So that's one thing they look at. And so the next thing that comes along is all the oil gas expansion. You can throw wind power in there as well. And the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service considers that an imminent threat. So it's kind of a long story, and I'll get into it a little bit later, but those industries are taking the steps now ahead of the game to try and change the way that goes. I will share with you this bird right here. This was a moving ground down in Wheeler County. I don't know if any of you have been to Wheeler County. It's a pretty good ways from here. But you talk about oil and gas expansion. Woo! One well every 40 acres. And they're packed in there like cordon. Used to be downtown Prairie Chickenville. This right here was the last bird I saw. I watched that moving ground. It was the last moving ground on the place that was active. It went from like 12 to 8 to 6 to 1. And I think the last time I saw it, I think that was in 2008, probably, sometime like that. So, if that continues, if these oil and gas companies don't step up and say, oil, gas, wind, transmission, and say, hey, all right, we recognize there's a problem, we'll back off, we'll do this, we'll make some agreements. If they just keep going like it's going, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service looks at that and says, well, you're threatening the prairie chicken. It's pushing the cart toward the cliff is what it's doing. The good news is that the Fish and Wildlife Service, they will consider every conservation action taken toward building habitat, toward conserving the species.
Like, where that bird's at that compressor station, do you think those are dying off, or do you think they're just moving somewhere else?
Well, no, they're dying off. And the reason I say that is because that's a pretty big ranch. Now, granted, we talk about how far they can move, but we know the males don't move very far, right? And so, what we'll do in the mornings, when we're doing those study areas, we'll get there, they'll start showing up 30 minutes before sunrise and talking. Boop, boop, boop. You hear a long ways off. So we'll get on a hill. I already know where this booming ground is because I've been checking it every year. And every year I drive all around the place. That particular country's, I think it's about 12,000 acres. And it's the only ones I can hear anywhere. And as those numbers disappear, they don't, if they're moving somewhere, they're moving at that 18, 20 mile mark, which the males, we don't have a lot of evidence to show that they do that right now. And so what it would look like is the hens don't like all the space around it. And maybe they quit using it, they quit reproducing. I don't know, we're still grasping at straws on that. We're still studying it. I don't think Texas Tech would like me to call their word grasping at straws. The good news is oil and gas guys, the Panhandle Producer Royalty Owners Association, it's a mouthful. In fact, I used to have their, I don't know if I still got it, agenda for their meeting. And of course I don't. I talk about it and I didn't have it with me. They talked about at their meeting, their little newsletter they put out, topic of this year's meeting, a Prairie Chicken CCAA, Candidate Conservation Agreement with Assurances, which basically they're going to start looking at, hey, all right, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, we see we're fixing to have an issue. Because this is some really good gas mains in here, and we really want to go get it. Because there's $1 gazillion laying under there. So how about we agree to, when we come in and drill, we'll just do maybe just 2 sections. And we'll do more directional drilling. And we'll minimize the number of roads we put in. And if we need a power line, we'll bury it. These types of things. And so the good news is that they're talking about that, and they're developing their own CCAA right now with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So, what can we, the little peons of Texas, do, the landowners, the poor state employees, to keep the federal government from coming riding down here and shoving stuff down our throat? The one thing we can do is enroll as much as we can in this CCAA. This is called a Candidate Conservation Agreement with Assurances. Candidate means right now the prairie chicken is on the Fed's candidate list. So back in the 90s, environmental group called the Forest Guardians, which I thought was very ironic that they're pursuing a prairie chicken. They filed a petition to sue the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in an attempt to force them to list the prairie chicken. And which they say, well, okay, yeah, we know it's a problem. We'll put it on the candidate list and we'll get around to it. They got a big long list of stuff they're looking at. Well, they rank that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, up to whatever ranking of importance or threat that they need the priority. Well, they rocked along prairie chickens for a pretty good while at number 12 on the candidate list, and then they bumped them up to a number 8 on the candidate list, and here a couple years ago they bumped them to a number 2, which means we're fixing to do something. So, it is right now still on the candidate list. As long as it is on the candidate list, Parks and Wildlife can offer to private landowners this agreement. If the bird gets, yes sir?
What's number 1?
Oh, I have no idea. I can't keep up with them. Polar bears or who knows.
Oh,
Lizard down south. Oh, the little lizard down south, the sand dune lizard. Excellent example of what we're talking about. They came out with their proposed listing. Said we are going to put the sand dune lizard on the threatened species list. Oh! So everybody had a freak out come apart about it. Good and well. So we need a 6-month extension while we try and gather and get some stuff put together. They said, okay, fine, you got 6 more months. See what you can do. They signed up a whole bunch of CCAAs, 90% some odd of the sand dune lizard country. The oil gas guys said, okay, here's what we'll do. And they said, okay, well, we won't listen. Woohoo! I'm greatly encouraged because the whole thing with the prairie chicken and the listing to me has just been a big roller coaster. And I was down in the dumps until they did not list the sand dune lizard. And I thought, ha, we got a chance. So, as long as it's a candidate species, we can offer the CCAA. As soon as, if it gets put on endangered or threatened, this opportunity for the landowners goes away. I'll make sure everybody understands that. So, it's for a candidate species. It's a conservation agreement with assurances. Now, the CCA's got a 2-pronged approach. Number one that I'm hoping is that we can sign up enough country that they don't list it. Go look at that and say, golly, Bonner and the Parks and Wildlife guys, they got a however many gazillion acres that represent a certain percentage of the prairie chicken country already signed up, so us listing it isn't going to do anything to build any more habitat. All those landowners that own that property are already grazing it, doing brush control, doing whatever else it is that they're doing that's resulting in good habitat. Us listing is not going to add any more conservation to that. Wrong number one. Wrong number two, if that fails, are these assurances. Everybody that signs up with a CCAA, while it's a candidate species, while it's available, if the bird gets put on the threatened or endangered list, cannot be prosecuted for take, what the feds call take. And I skipped that whole talk about take a little while ago for some reason. All right, if the bird gets listed, there's not going to be a long list of things that says, all right, you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't do this. It's one simple statement. You can't do anything that results in what the feds call take. And take is defined as killing, harming, harassing, teasing, calling his mama dirty names, or whatever, anything else to a prairie chicken, including damages to habitat that might reduce the reproductive potential, which could be spraying brush, could be grazing cattle too hard, not leaving enough nesting cover. It could be a lot of things. So everybody that gets signed up in the CCAA, and the way that CCAA works is it's an agreement between the Parks and Wildlife and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And it gives us a permit for take, which means we still get to do take if it happens while we're doing certain activities, grazing cattle, treating brush, disking, doing prescribed fire, all these things we still do. If it results in incidental take, we're still going to be okay. They can't prosecute us for it. We can offer that same protection to the landowners through the CCAA, and we tie that together with what's called the Wildlife Management Plan. Don't get all scooped up about the management plan. It's very vague in general. I'll get to it here in just a second. But the way those assurances work, you can't be prosecuted for take if something you did resulted in take, if that something you did was in your management plan. And if it gets on the endangered list down the road, the feds can't show up and ask you to do anything else other than what you agreed to in that management plan. And so that's good news. So, I wish I quit hitting that button. Incidental take. All right, I already explained it. So that outlines things like grazing, brush management, scrap fire, for me, I've already said that as well. I get a little ahead of myself. I get excited sometimes, sorry. Offer that to the landowners. And the way we tie that, the landowners in with that, is with the wildlife management plan. Now I'll get to the plan here in just a second. So if you sign up, the feds can't ask you to do anything else other than what's in your plan, and you can't be prosecuted for take. Now, the management plan, don't be scared of a management plan because it is very simple. The goal of this management plan is to create a desired habitat condition. There are going to be no specifics in this management plan of things like you have to have 25 head of mama cows in this pasture from April until June, then they gotta be out of there by June 15th into the next pasture, and they can stay there till October the 31st, and they gotta be out of there. And then you have to treat 1,000 acres of sagebrush here, and you have to treat 1,000 acres of mesquite, and it has to be done by 2014. There's gonna be nothing like that. No specifics. And the reason we don't want specifics in it is because what we want is this desired habitat condition. And how you get there, we don't care, as long as it looks like this. The biggest thing in most of the country is grazing and brush control. And grazing, we somewhat vague. It'll be extremely vague. I've got guys that do a conservative stocking rate up in the northeastern panhandle, 40 acres per annum is pretty conservative. I got guys that do stalker operations in a high intensity, low frequency. They're only in the pasture for about 3 to 7 days, got it all cut up with these electric fences. And all those places, whatever they're doing, the operation that's meeting their needs is also meeting this desired habitat condition, which is a grassland-dominated landscape with scattered shrubs and enough use to make some weeds. So, my pointer. So here's the nesting cover we were talking about earlier. Remember I said there was grass that was grown the year before and still standing there? I took this picture in February. There's a little snow down there. I took this picture in February because it's upcoming about a month or so, and the hens are going to start nesting. And so here's a good looking little patch of little blue stem there for nesting. And it's been getting enough grazing pressure to create some open areas and a little hoof action to get some weeds going. There's some scattered shrubs for some overhead cover from them hawks who are unsuccessful. And there's some short grass country of open, it doesn't have to be big, I'm talking about the size of this room. Something that they can use for a moving ground. So, that is the desired habitat condition. And really, that's really easy to meet. And the number one biggest thing tends to be stocking rates when I get to visit with folks. All right, now in the management plan, there's a list of agreed to practices. And we'll make sure everybody understands what those are. There's some of these in here that some of you will never have much of a use for. And the big reason is that these prairie chickens tend to live in sandy country. Sand doesn't need any help making weeds. It does it pretty good all by itself. Disking, we put this up northeast, got some clay loam soil, some short mid-grass country that has chickens in it. It doesn't like to give up weeds. It needs a little soil disturbance. This will be in here to make sure, if you ever do, you never know, there may be some crazy guy come out of Houston want to pay you $15 an acre for quail hunting. And say, boy, it'd be good for me if you could disc through here. Yes, sir, 15 bucks an acre? Let me go get my tractor. And we'll make sure that you're protected to do these kinds of things. Brush management, this will be a big one down in this country. Shinnery, mesquite, get a little further south. We want to make sure that you get to keep doing brush work. And the way something like that's going to read is if you've got a shinnery issue, start chipping away at your shinnery. Go up to the NRCS office, see what you can get for Prairie Chicken Initiative money. Still 75% cost share. And you can even follow that with some prescribed grazing incentive. At how much? $6.50 an acre?
I think so. $6.50 or so.
Somewhere in that neighborhood. So it's helped to help you do it. Native grass restoration, that's going to be up to the landowner. It would be good if some of these expiring CRP, I don't know if they're working on getting what they call the SAFE program, which is plants expiring CRP in the native. They're working on getting another 150,000 acres approved for that.
And that's what you guys call the Prairie Chicken Program. A lot of the producers here call it the Prairie Chicken Program. It's the same, it's technically safe, y'all, but I know y'all call it the Prairie Chicken Program.
Okay, yeah, good. I want to make sure we speak the language properly. Native grass restoration, that can also be old abandoned paths, old abandoned oil field roads, things like that. Prescribed burning, is there anybody here doing prescribed burning on their place? But haven't, well, yeah, out. Nobody would this year, but have in the past. All good. Incredible tool. It really surprises me. The difference it makes in a piece of country. And also amazes me the difference in the mindsets. Now, granted, we had a year like we had last year, where half the state was on fire at some point in time. And then up in the Northeast, 2006, we had 750,000 acres. Poof! In a matter of hours, one day.
5 days?
Huh?
I think 5 days.
Oh, yeah.
Just over 5
The
days.
fires burned for 5 days, but the 98% of that burned that day, the Sunday. The rest of it just kind of trickled around. Those are bad news, devastating fires. And so then you want to show up and start telling some of these landowners, hey, you know what you ought to do? You ought to burn this. You know, they can't. I had to drive up to Kansas City here a couple of weeks ago. It's a long story, I won't bore you why, but driving up Interstate 35 through Kansas, through the Flint Hills of Kansas, which, by the way, that's a toll road that charges $6 to drive on, in case you don't know. I went around coming back. But when you drive through there, they got huge signs on the side of the highway that say, warning, beware, range burning area, do not drive into dense smoke. And so common and so accepted up there that they put out signs on the highway to keep people careful about it. Now granted, they also get about 30 inches more rainfall than we do. And so that's something they do every year. And but anyway, it's a good tool, something to think about. There's not going to be anything here that says you have to burn 1,000 acres right here in this fashion. You got to have it done by this such and such time. It's a good tool. There's the Panhandle Prescribed Burn Association that has recently been started. Fencing. Don't know how much stuff is fenced. A lot of the CRP stuff ain't hardly fenced at all. Hey, ain't our local DC? Are they going to come up with money to fence the perimeter of CRP?
As of right now, there's not.
They're working on it?
I don't know.
Still talk. I've heard talk about it.
I think there's talk higher up, but nothing that we've heard trickle down.
Well, that won't be effective. But basically talk about ways to keep this stuff in grass. Because even some of the old expiring CRP, it's been long enough, we've been love grass. You leave it alone long enough, don't do anything with it, it kind of chokes himself out and gets natives coming in there. We're seeing that now and seeing birds pop up in those areas. And so we're just trying to think creative ways to keep that in grass.
And we're seeing that in existing CRPs right now that were planted to love grass and that have started killing themselves out and natives have been popping up. We've been seeing that a lot this year.
The other thing on fences, some old boys over in Oklahoma, they weren't even doing research on fences. They had some transmitted birds, and what they began to notice was that, wow, we're finding a lot of these dead birds laying close to a fence. I bet they crashed into a fence and killed themselves. And anyway, the feds got a hold of that, and which, by the way, I don't know if y'all know it or not, but Oklahoma, when they settled Oklahoma, they did it on quarter sections. So there's a fence every quarter section. Anyway, whatever, the research is there, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has a hold of it, and if you got a booming ground that lies inside the quarter mile of the fence, then they're going to ask you to mark that fence with these little white tags, and basically it's just little pieces of like vinyl siding cut up and just hung on your fence.
Why?
So that the little prairie chickens can see them better when they're
Oh,
flying.
tag so that they won't run into.
So that they won't crash into them. Cropland, there's a part there on cropland management. We can cover some of the cropland if it adjoins some grassland. And if there's something going on in that cropland that's going to offer something to prairie chickens in terms of food or something like that. If it can offer one little piece of habitat, I can include that. If it's an isolated piece of farm ground, can't help you, because that's not offering anything under your control to prairie chicken habitat. There's a part in there on grazing. Up in the northeastern panhandle, this tends to be hang up number one. I would say that most of the time, the vast majority, I'd say 80% of the folks that we've signed up so far, all savvy range managers, great cattlemen, they understand they're in the grass growing business. take great care of the country, and it's a pleasure to write these CCAAs because I don't have to do anything. I'm going to show up and say, all right, tell me what you and your family have been doing for the last 3 generations, and that's going to be your management plan. But we've got to leave that nesting cover out. And for those of you that are worried about how much of my grazing business are you going to get, because you start talking to a rancher about grazing cows, and it's like telling him how to raise his children. So this was one of my landowners I wrote a CCAA with up in the northeastern panhandle. And this I copy and pasted. This is his prescribed grazing plan in his wildlife management plan that he will be held to, quote, held to. And you'll notice all it's got in is a ballpark stocking range. And it talks about flexibility. It talks about adapting to conditions. The biggest things in here is to take half, leave half, which nobody's been grazing cows for a while, has not heard that before. Take half, leave half, and remaining flexible to the unpredictable climate and rainfall. Okay? That's the way these plans will read. Now, there are situations where we run into where we got to make some adaptations. Because if it looks like this right here, I'm going to say, this is fabulous, tell me what you've been doing. And if it looks like this, we're going to have to negotiate making some changes of some kind. And the reason is the CCA, for me to protect a piece of property with a CCAA, it has got to be offering prairie chicken habitat. And that includes nesting habitat. And grazing at that intensity doesn't provide nesting habitat. And I also want y'all to keep in mind that we're pretty savvy guys. None of us are from New Jersey or Delaware or anything like that. And I'm not offending anybody if you have family from there or anything. Okay? We're pretty savvy guys. We know good and well that we just come out of, still in, one of the worst droughts in the history of Texas. So all the landowners that I've gone and met with in the last year, I know good and well I'm looking at grass that was grown in 2010. And a lot of that grass is dead. So we understand these things. And so it's not going to be a type of deal of, hey, quit raining, you better get all these cows out of here so that chicken's got a little hunk of grass to nest in. We're going to want you to be thinking drought, and if you haven't thought drought before this year, you have, now you have. I mean, everybody's called hard, they've sold it weaning weights, got rid of the old ones, even if they were still producing a couple of calves, and everybody is struggling to stay alive right now. And with the way the corn forecast is, it doesn't look too much shinier in the future. So I would say on the places that have called me interested in the CCAA right now, I'd say only about 20% of those, if I had to, maybe a little higher than that now, in the last couple of weeks, but ballpark around there, have I gone out and looked and said, you know what, we're going to have to make some changes. What can you do? Let's talk about some ideas. What can you do? So you've dropped your numbers back, so you've already gone through the hurtful part of it. How long do you think you could stay here until we get some of the grasses out? I'll invite them to my office, where we'll sit down and look at, y'all remember the old soil conservation books? You know, had all the soils going in there, you know, Potter loans and all that kind of stuff. And they got a great website now, NRCS does. It is fantastic, called the Web Soil Survey. And inside there, I can take a map of the property, clip it to all the range sites, and it'll tell me what percentage of those range sites your country makes up, plus it'll give me some forage production estimates. Then we can start looking at stocking rates. And if that doesn't, so far that's been fairly satisfactory for everybody. If you want to get out and do clipping, we can set up and do that as well. That's a little more time consuming, and I may pass you on to your local NRCS office for that type of assistance. But I want everybody to feel confident that we're not just wing-dinging around throwing out numbers that came out of a textbook or out of somebody sitting in a cubicle in Washington or something. And I would say of those that have called me, I would say right now, more than half of the folks I've met with agreed, okay, yep, I hear what you're saying. We want the CCA, we want that protection, we'll go ahead, we'll agree to make some changes. The rest have said, okay, appreciate your time. No, we're gonna keep doing what we've been doing. So know that, it's not, if you want, have us out, let's talk, look at it, and talk about it. All right, so say you are interested, how's the process work? We're almost there, by the way. Number one thing, holler at me or Todd and say, okay, I want to do that, come out and see my place. We're going to ride around, we're going to look at the plant community, because I want to see what kind of shape it's in. And when I was talking about the drought thing, one of the things that I'll look at when I come out there is the plant community. I'm not so much looking at the height of the grass, especially right now. Everybody's pretty short right now. But I want to know what that community's like, because it's going to tell me what's been going on for the last 10 years. So if I show up and I see sand blue stem, big blue stem, and I see Indian grass, and I see lots of little blue stem, even if it's short and laid over and half dead at this point, he's still there. And those are ice cream plants. And if they're still there and they're still there productive, that tells me that whatever's been going on for the last 10 years has been a good thing. Because if you think of it like, cows are particular about what they eat. Versus if I went out there and it was all sand drop seed, threons, muleys, and things like that, those harsh, coarse, unpalatable grasses, that would tell me that the vast majority of the good stuff has been grazed out. So it's kind of like locking a bunch of kindergarten kids in a room with a bowl of Hershey bars and a bowl of Brussels sprouts. And at the end of the day, you're going to have a bowl of Brussels sprouts. And so what we're looking at out there in the pasture is how many Hershey bars have we got left in the pasture. So, once we do that, we will need a legal description of the property, survey block and section numbers. We'll build a map of the property, and we'll do that to a degree to meet your satisfaction, really. If you want some help with some grazing or brush control or fencing or something like that, we can help you do those kinds of things, probably in concert with your NRCS office. We will write up a wildlife management plan. We can look at that here in a second if y'all express the interest to do that. We'll send it to you. You read it over. Make sure you're good with it. You got concerns, things you want to change, you holler at me. We'll talk about it and get it squared away until you're satisfied and we're satisfied. Once we get that done, I got to get the Fed's approval. We'll send it to a biologist in Lubbock. He's a pretty savvy guy, ground savvy guy. He used to work for us. He went to the dark side. I couldn't stop him.
Some of you guys know Dwayne Lucia, and that's who he's talking about in Lubbock.
No, Dwayne Lucia.
I know.
Nobody knows?
Jack, you've worked with Dwayne.
Yeah.
Yep.
So once that's all square, I'll ask you to sign the wildlife management plan, and I'll also ask you to sign what's called the Certificate of Inclusion into our CCAA. And that piece of paper and the management plan and a map of the property and the legal description, I'll ship that off to our district office in Canyon. They'll keep a copy of it there. Then it gets shipped to Austin. They keep a copy there. Our executive director, Carter P. Smith, will sign it. Then it goes to Arlington, Texas, where Tom Cloud, supervisor of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, they'll keep the originals, they'll sign it, copy gets back to you, and you're good to go.
How long does that process take?
From the time I put it in the mail or from the time you call and say, hey, Jeff?
Yeah, the time you call.
Time you call. I would say the way things are right now, so we've got, from the result of all the meetings we've been having in the Panhandle right now, I've got 35 different places that we're working on. If I just had one, could focus on it, do nothing, go see the place, sit down and write it up. Kids don't have too much camp or softball junk. I could probably knock that out in a week. If it wasn't already mapped. If it's already mapped, if you've already done some equip stuff or anything within NRCS, chances are they've already been out and mapped it. I pick up the phone and say, hey Kayla, can you email me guy's shape file? She'll call you and say, hey, I want to send this to you. Can you sign a piece of paper? Yeah, sure. Okay, send it to you. Bam, just save me 2-3 days work. And I'm getting pretty fast in now, because now what I'll do when I come out and meet with you, I'll bring my computer, I'll pull up the management plan itself, we'll sit through, punch out the rough, ugly stuff, and I'll go back to my office, and I'll write in and copy and paste in the warm, fuzzy, flowery stuff that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is looking for. So yeah, I can do that in a week. Right now, it's backlogged as bad as we are, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service sometimes kind of drag, like after I've been waiting a week to hear back from them on 2 plans I sent them. So, I would say ballpark, you're talking month and some change. And that'd be pretty quick. I'd say 2 months should be done. Yes, sir.
Okay, so we did agree to this, and we signed up. What would be the term length of this agreement?
Very good. The question is, what's the term length of the agreement? From, if the bird gets listed, then the CCAA offers you that protection for 20 years.
I got a question.
Hold on, I'm sorry, just 1 second. I beat you back there just by a millisecond.
What if it's land that's in the CRP that's gonna be coming out in 10 years, and you're wanting to graze it or break it back out? Can you write that in the WMP or?
Right, that created a massive upheaval because the marching orders that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service gave us several months ago was, yep, we'll cover CRP. If it's offering chicken habitat, we want to keep it covered. And I was like, excellent. And then they kind of, 2 days ago?
Yes.
Yesterday?
2 days.
Yeah, 2 days ago, they kind of all of a sudden sat up, and somebody finally far enough up the ladder, sitting in a cubicle somewhere, got a hold of that and went, oh, well, that's got a federal something or another tied to it. But we've been reassured as of what, 2 hours, 3 hours ago, that we will get to cover CRP fields with the CCAA. Now, the part about when it comes out, well, they're still a little fuzzy on that one.
And the safe ground too would be the same.
Native ground?
No, the safe, in the safe program, I'm assuming.
Right.
It would be the same.
Right. Yeah, well, then they don't see they didn't know it. They already signed up some safe, I've already signed up safe acres that they didn't think about it. So anyway, yeah, they're in a bit, they're talking about it. And so I can't speak, I'm sorry, I can't speak for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I will say right now, CRP, we can cover CRP right now with CCAA. What happens when it comes out? Can you drop that? Can you drop that portion? Like say you own 10,000 acres, you got a quarter section in CRP or 1 section in CRP, and you want to break it out and do whatever you want with it. I can't say right now how that will work. But I do know from right now, I've been told that we will cover that CRP with CCAA right now.
If you chose to graze it instead of break it out, would the grazing management plan that you put in place not cover that?
Yes, it would. In fact, that's what we would be pushing, hoping, and negotiating with you with is to keep it grass. This is another thing. Part of the problem is getting the FSA office. What the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service says is the FSA office is kind of being a little slow to get on board and start making some decisions on what you're going to do. And say again.
So welcome to our world.
Right. What the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service people have told me is that if and when, well, what they're going to strive to do, and this is a direct quote, is make CRP, if it's in chicken country, make it easy to stay in and make it easy to sign up. If they lose 1,000 acres, we'll work toward replacing that 1,000 acres somewhere else. Yes, ma'am?
I'm sorry, what is the certificate of inclusion?
The certificate of inclusion, we'll move your stuff here, okay? Let's just look at that right quick. So, certificate of inclusion is, oops, that's not the plan. This is the CCAA, the agreement right here. Okay, this is a big hairy 32-page document. So, to answer your question right quick, down here on page 24, it's 16, getting warm. 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, certificate of inclusion. Okay, so this is a part of this is the tail end of the CCAA. And basically what it says this landowner down below agrees to the CCAA, has agreed to a wildlife management plan. We're going to offer you protection for the concept, because you're doing things to help grow chicken habitat. And because you are, we're going to promise that if you do something that results in incidental take, we're not going to prosecute you. And we're not going to show up and ask you to do anything else other than what's already you've agreed to in your plan. And then at the bottom of that page is a place for you, the landowner, to sign, and that all gets sent around to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, like I said, Tom McLeod, and then TPWD, our Executive Director, Carter Schmidt. Now, if y'all would like, I tend to give everybody a copy of this. I will warn you, it was written by biologists and then lawyers. So it's a tough read. I tried to read it, but I kept falling asleep. You can't help it. It's a heck of a cure for insomnia if you're one of those that has a hard time going to sleep at night. Whether or not you read it, I'm not going to say how many people read it, but everybody I signed with CCAA, I give them this to make sure they got it. And most of the questions you might have about it might be answered in there. Yes, sir.
Well, if you're already in the SAFE program, there'd be nothing for you to come look at, would there? Since there's already somebody overseeing that?
No. I'm still going to want to lay eyes on it.
And how does that CCAA help us if we're in the SAFE program already? That's in case it goes in danger?
Right, right, it's in case it goes in danger, plus they're not gonna, when they come to look at, let me get back to my talk right quick, and I'll show you a quick map. So what they're looking at an acre number. Okay? Now, so there may be some safe in there, which is fantastic chicken habitat, that we already know. And it was designed to be. We modeled it after Kansas's stuff, after all for their CRP. And so, I guess what I'm getting at is every acre counts. And so if it's already chicken habitat, and it's already dedicated to chicken habitat, it was intentionally planted for chicken habitat, and it's enrolled for 20 years, they may say, well, I'm okay, I don't have to enroll now. But the higher that number right there in chicken country gets, the bigger wallop our one bullet will have at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Yes, sir.
If you're in the SAFE program already, you planted a mixture of prairie chickens, will we have to do anything different than we're doing to comply with your plan?
Not outside just some, what are your management options on that safe? It's planted, you walk away and leave it? Are you allowed to?
Then we got this shredded, I think.
You have a mid-contract management that y'all have to complete by year 9 of your contract.
Yeah. Which is, can they burn it?
They can burn it, they can
It's cheaper.
graze it, hay it, shred it, do some light disking or aeration. You can plant, enhance more native grasses and forbs into it.
My question is, will we need to do anything else?
Other than the thing she's talking about, no. It's like,
It sounds like we're already set up.
We're already
right. Well,
But he's gonna have some kind of plan. I just wanna know.
it's not going to be much different than what Kayla just described. The reason is, it's got to be doing something. And the reason is because it's good for the grass. God made grass to be eaten and consumed or burned or removed every bit as much as he did for it to build a place for a chicken to build a nest.
I think that's my question. I got a second part.
Okay.
Is it an all or none? Do you have to sign up all your property, all your land? You can designate which part you want,
That's
and
correct.
which part you don't.
That's correct. You can sign up. The question was, can you sign up part of the place? You got to sign up the whole place. The answer is you can sign up part.
What if it changes ownership?
It is transferable as long as either the buyer or the kids, whoever it is that's taking it over, agrees to the plan.
If they don't,
Well, then they'll get dropped.
That's it. If you don't want it anymore, you can
Oh,
stop at any time.
I left out that little tidbit. That's a nice one too.
Is there any penalty for this?
No penalty. There's no money involved in this whatsoever. You don't get nothing other than protection. And so if you want out, you pick up the phone, say, Jeff, I've had enough of this, I want out, and I'll say, okay, write me a letter that says that and sign it, and you're out,
But you're no longer protected.
and you're no longer protected.
On that part about the safe, and I would assume that the CRP would be similar too, right?
Yes, those should run hand in hand.
You don't foresee you wanting to do any of the like the mid contract management any sooner than that? You don't foresee that you would require?
Well, all right, question is, would I foresee on SAFE or CRP doing something earlier than what the big contract management part, like 9 years? To me, that's gonna depend on what it looks like and what it's doing. Now, like I already said in the management plan, you notice there's not gonna be any dates, there's not gonna be deadlines, there's not gonna be acre minimums or anything like that. What I might say something in the SAFE is do something to keep this lively and productive. Remove it, burn it, raise it, do something.
If you came out and wanted us to do something different, we could just say no and get out.
Well, that's right. Well, but I'm not gonna, yeah. It's not like.
My concern is there's gonna be some requirements that I might not want to comply with.
Such as, give me a specific example.
Something that costs a lot of money, whatever that could be.
Oh, in a safe, the only thing that most of these folks in this country are gonna face that may be it's costly is just some shimmery control or sagebrush control. That's the most expensive thing that we're talking about. And what's that run? And mesquite. And what's the dollars on that right now?
I have no idea. Depending upon what fund code and things like that you start messing with, because
Okay.
NRCS does have a mutual, an agreement with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services. So if you want to be in a certain pot of money to get used that LPCI, that Lesser Prairie Incentive Initiative through EQIP, there's also, to get that higher rate, you have other agreements that you have to